So David Duhalde is the vice chair of the DSA fund. And for those who don't know, that's DSA's like sister educational nonprofit. He is actually the former DSA deputy director. He formerly represented DSA in Chile during the 2021 presidential elections, and he is a frequent contributor to Jacobin. So that article that was sent this week that a lot of people were talking about was, David's article. Everyone, we saw, there was a lot of discussion in branches online about the recent Chilean presidential elections. And so he's here to talk to us about those elections and the exciting election of Gabriel Boric. So take it away, David.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be speaking to Atlanta DSA, and I just want to thank again for the invitation. I have a real soft spot in my heart for the chapter. In my first DSA convention in 2007 was in Atlanta at the IBEW Hall, where I met Barbara Joy and Milt Tamber and a lot of other folks. So I'm just going to do my share screen now. So give me 1 second, but while I'm doing that, I'm just going to say that this is going to be a mixture of like a political analysis and what I did kind of last summer. And so I will break down the presentation as so. So I'm going to first go over the Estadio Social. So it's like the big social uprisings of 2019 that led to the political conditions that allowed the election of Gabriel Boric, the leftist incoming president. I'll talk about the 2021 Chilean elections, not just the ones that I saw, but the ones beforehand, which I'll explain more in detail. I'll just cover the activities I did as a DSA delegate there. I was not the only international delegate in the country. So there were activities I joined, but there were also activities and actions I took by myself representing DSA. And then I'll cover some conclusions, and there's been some updates since then of Boric's announcing of his new cabinet, I believe, yesterday. And so I'll discuss those a little bit as well. The picture here is of a Boric poster, but if you look at the top, it's for Chileans who are living in Costa Rica. Chileans recently have the ability to vote abroad. My dad's a Chilean national, so he voted to New York, and it was a big change. It also helps facilitate ways that DSA should connect maybe with Chileans and other communities who, through our international work, who are living here to support them. As the speaker before mentioned, I have written articles on Chile. So my presentation here will cover kind of 3 articles that I wrote, one in 2019 for Jacobin, the one article I think you all saw, but also I would encourage people to check out my report back specific about the Chilean election that I did for DSA's own Democratic Left blog. So these will be well referenced. The picture here is of student activists with the Democratic Revolution Party. But,
David, I don't think we can see your screen. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, that would have been good to know earlier. Okay, let me try that again. Do people see any screen now?
Yeah, we do.
Yes.
Which one do you see?
The students.
Okay, great. So now, do you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, great. This is now it's out of the, okay. So now it's better? Yeah, okay. Thanks, Kelsey. Body language. So the students here we were marching to the Sierra de Campaña, which I'll go over in a second, but you can see them wearing DSA buttons. People were really excited that DSA was there, and I couldn't get rid of those buttons and stickers I brought when like hotcakes, as people would say. But you'll notice the woman is pointing the finger up like number 1, and she's doing that because And you'll see that occasionally in the pictures. That's because the Chilean presidential candidates have numerical positions on the ballot. So like the right-wing candidate was number 2. And so people, so it's just a universally party, people will put like whatever their candidate's numbers in their hand. Boric just had the good fortune of being 1, which is easy to remember and looks more attractive. So we should first kind of go over, before we talk about the elections themselves, discuss the political conditions that led up to it. So Chile, in short, very, very short, and we can go over this more in the Q&A, you know, had a right-wing military dictatorship from 73 to 1990, but by the late 80s had already made efforts to have a plebiscite, which is the Chilean way, the Chilean term for like a national referendum, to move past that dictatorship. But so even though Chile did get rid of the dictatorship, the kind of neoliberalism, especially like authoritarian policies that had real free market policies that had been forced on the country, they couldn't really get rid of them. So examples of those would be like Chile doesn't have Social Security the way we do. It has privatized pensions that are incredibly unpopular, that the military government set up, that like even as right-wing as our governments have gotten in the United States, they've never been able to do that. And it shows that like people can really only accept that if they're like forced to by a gun. And there's been other, and then the education system too, which used to be much more equitable, even among those who could get it, you know, has really become privatized like the States. So that kind of, and that Chile, which we'll go over also in some other slides, really was effectively governed by, while a multi-party system, really was governed by 2 coalitions, a center-right one, a center-left one, and a right-wing one that alternated power for 30 years until recently. And these people, and they administrated neoliberalism in different ways. Obviously, the center-left was a little more equitable, tried to smooth out the rough edges, but they were really maintaining the same system. And Chileans eventually became increasingly restive, you know, and rebellious against this. And then the spark that happened, which is called the Estadio Social, which is like social uprising, in like Chile despierta, Chile awoke, was really started in October 19. So I was actually able to go there coincidentally representing myself. I went to a conference held by parties that actually later became Boric's coalition in Frente Amplio, which means broad front. And I took this picture while I was there in Bacadano, which was the center of the big uprising. So if you've seen like the pictures of that uprising with the millions of people, that was in this place that used to be called Plaza Italia, like Italian Plaza. Now it's called Plaza Dignidad. The people have renamed it to be about gaining dignity. So technically this came about because there was a very small, by a few pennies, fare hike, but it really was just the straw that broke the camel's back. And it caused, and that led to this rebellion. But what's important to also know is this wasn't the first rebellion. It was just really the major rebellion that also involved working class people. There were 2 previous uprisings that I mentioned here, but they were more education related, led by students, and many, including Boric himself, who in Chile. And the first was in 2006, the Penguin Revolution. It's called that because lots of students in Chile, even in the public schools, wear school uniforms, so they look like penguins because they're black and white. And then there was Chile Winter in 2011. That's where like people like Boric, but also 2 of his ministers, Giorgio Jackson from the Democratic Revolution Party and Camila Vallejos from the Communist Party, became national figures during that time. So as I mentioned, this is Estadio Social. So this is the same place that I was, but you notice the statue is gone. This is a picture I took in 2021. I'm showing my age. 2021. So I just wanted to show you the park. It's still it's still a center of political action. And even during their the right-wing candidate tried to do a PR stunt because if you notice the grass, there isn't really grass there anymore, and they planted some temporary grass, but they only got to do half of it. And then so it kind of blew up in their face because then Boric was like, look, they only care about half the country. That's what their government's going to be like, which was like a really good response. That really kind of undermined the right-wing arguments. And so this also led to a massive repression against the Chilean political activists and also just people who were there. So there was the police repression led to like dozens of deaths and hundreds of blindings. And actually one of the people who was usually people were kind of only blinded in one eye. I mean, only, and so there was like a lot of people who would do, symbolically covering their eye, but there was actually a woman who was fully blinded, and she recently became a senator. So it shows the kind of like political response to this violence has actually been met by like elevating these activists and political figures. When I was there, one of the first days I got there, there was an agreement to kind of in 2019, I'm still talking about 2019, to placate and end the kind of marches through an agreement to create a new constitutional process. The Communist Party stayed out of this agreement because they really wanted to keep the social movements going, but Gabriel Borodic's Frente Amplio, the coalition I mentioned earlier, that was my host, were supportive of it. And Boric himself played a real role in those negotiations, which I think helped him win the presidency because he was viewed as a spy, by the voters as a kind of a compromiser and serious actor. So what was this constitutional process and why does it matter? So so while I mentioned earlier the Chileans voted to end their dictatorship, they actually couldn't get rid of their constitution that was established by the Pinochet dictatorship, who was the military ruler for those 17 years. And and like our constitution, like the Chilean constitution is set to like make change very hard, especially majoritarian progressive change, very difficult. And so it really was a symbol of like these vestiges of the military junta that Chileans just couldn't get rid of and really were blocking them from creating a more equitable society. So as part of the 2019 agreement, there was a plebiscite, as I mentioned, national referendum that would happen. It got delayed a bunch because of COVID, as has delayed a lot of our lives. But the text there was pretty simple. It was like and I summarized it as like, do you want a new constitution? And if you did want it, and if there is a new constitution, how do you want it? Do you want it organized by a new body that is completely elected just to do this? Or do you want a mixed assembly of people who are of elected representatives and congresspeople? So by nearly 4-to-1 margin in both, Chileans voted to have a new referendum and to also make it just so it's new people who are determining the new constitution. And the constitution itself will be sent back to the Chilean people in a mandatory vote. So you notice there's only 50% turnout here. The next time the Chileans vote, it's an obligatory vote. And the key thing here, which will come up again, is like, you could see it was overwhelmingly popular. So the only people who opposed it were really the diehard Pinochet, right-wing people, including Jose Antonio Cast, who we'll talk about in a second, who is the right-wing candidate that Boric faced off in the final round. But overall, like even the center-right and moderate people, overwhelmingly wanted to get rid of the Pinochet constitution. So that's important to kind of keep in the back of your heads for the rest of the presentation. So Boric ran on a coalition called Apruebo Dignidad, which is kind of like Approved Dignity. So to make it complicated, this is a coalition of coalitions. So there is Frente Amplio, who I've mentioned a few times. So that's Democratic. The largest party in that is Democratic Revolution, and that name comes from a phrase, from a saying of Allende about the Chilean Allende, who was the socialist president of Chile until 1973, about the need for a democratic revolution, and the other major party, Social Convergence or Convergencia Social. That's Boric's party. So Boric's party is a smaller party, but it's like the second biggest in the coalition. And then there's Chile Digno, which I roughly translate to Worthy Chile or Dignified Chile, depends how you want to translate it. And that's really mainly the Communist Party. And the Communist Party in Apruebo Dignidad was the oldest and more historic party of all the parties who part of that. And and really had probably the largest working class base. I mean, closer to the labor unions, and also a social green regionalist federation. So they had a primary also. So what's interesting is that the coalition, in Chile, the government can also help coalitions host their primaries. They don't have to do it internally. And there was actually an upset where people assumed that Daniel Hadwe, who is the communist mayor, a Palestinian Chilean of a working class community called Recoleta, which is in the capital region. So it's near Santiago. If you think of, some of you may think if you know Chile's geography, you know Santiago is the capital, but Chile has like a metropolitan region that has different communities. Kind of like LA is a good reference point about how the patchwork works, where LA is really a huge patchwork of different communities around it. And he was leading, and he was much more known by the community. And if you actually want to get to know him better, there's a good Daniel Denver has a good Dig episode in Spanish, but they speak very slowly and clearly, where he interviews him. But I think that Hadwe ended up losing, but in this huge turnout primary, we can see 1.7 million people showed up. And I think he lost for a couple of different reasons. And I think one is I don't think he really was ready to run a national campaign. And I think anti-communism in Chile is very deep. And I think people, and since it was really just him versus Boric, I think there were a lot of people who were like, well, a communist probably can't win. And so I'm going to support Boric instead. So Boric, I think, won kind of through somewhat anti-communism, both fair and unfair in terms of like what actually might work in the general election. I think Hadwe's own campaigning, and I think just Boric was kind of like in this, it didn't shake the boat too much and kind of sailed in. So who is he? As I mentioned earlier, besides having a beard like me, he was a student union leader in the University of Chile. So University of Chile is the most important and prestigious public university in the country. And he comes from the south of Chile. His last name is Croatian. There's lots of Croatians who live there. So it's pretty typical. It makes sense. That's why he doesn't have a Spanish name, because he's from the real south of Chile, where there's a huge population. And so he was elected to then represent, even though he studied in Santiago, he was then elected to represent his home area. He was, as I mentioned earlier, he was a key negotiator in the compromise to kind of end the social uprising, which didn't really end the social uprising per se, but did set the process to create the constitutional convention and hopefully the new Chilean constitution. And then he's also been a member of different political formations, but that have now formed this Convergencia Social or Social Convergence Party, which in all those formations have been part of the Broad Front or the Frente Amplio. On foreign policy, he is very pro-Palestinian, which is actually not a huge shock in Chile, because as I mentioned, Daniel Hadwe is not a coincidence. Chile has the largest Palestinian community outside of the Middle East, and it's a very historic community. It's pre-Nakba, so it's before Israel was created. So they are more established so they have a lot of political power for as well. So he has been very critical, and even recently, of Nicaragua and Venezuelan leadership. So he's a leftist, but he also has distanced himself from those governments. And I think what's important to know in the backdrop, there's two things which I kind of learned when I was there, knew but really got to understand deeper. One is that the support for the Nicaraguan Sandinistas is somewhat generational, where even young communists aren't as like enthusiastic about Ortega's government as older folks are. So the border kind of represents a generational transformation there, and that there's lots and lots of Venezuelans in Chile now who are mostly economic migrants. They're not like political, they're not there for political reasons because they don't like or dislike Maduro, but Chile has a very good economy, so they've come there. And so kind of a lot of the anti-socialism in Chile that you kind of see here too, the States now has shifted to like being like anti-Venezuela. But he is interested in, and he talked about this even recently, reestablishing ties with Bolivia. If you don't know, Chile actually historically doesn't have, even though it borders Bolivia, doesn't have good relations with Bolivia because Chile essentially stole, the two top regions the Chile's two top regions were Bolivia's two bottom regions that was stolen during what is called the War of the Pacific, which really cheated Bolivia out of access to the sea, which is critical, and also a lot of minerals and nitrates, which is it's a reason why Chile is much richer than Bolivia. Domestically, he's focused much more on economic employment policies, not labor policies, and by that I'm distinguishing. He's less focused on unions than he is on like working conditions. And I'm just saying that objectively. I'm not saying that's good or bad. We can get into that in the discussion. So you'll see like he's been pushing like a minimum wage increase and like a 40-hour work week. But also there's a lot of efforts to focus on Chile's minerals. So Chile is historically known for really a lot of its national money comes from, not the majority, but a lot, comes from its copper. And Chile nationalized its copper under Allende, and even the right-wing government didn't privatize it because it was such a huge source. And Chile now has an important lithium reserve. And so there's a push to, one of his pushes is going to be to nationalize that. So, and not let that get into private hands. So right now, water in Chile is privatized. So there's a lot of effort to actually socialize and nationalize resources like that. And he's also, I mentioned the pension reform, so I won't focus on that again, but I think there's also an effort. Chile is a national police force, unlike in the States, we have like, there's like Metro Atlanta PD, there's NYPD. Like, no, there's just like one police force in all of Chile. And historically it hasn't been corrupt, but that's changed over the years. And so there's efforts to maybe actually make it more regional to kind of stop corruption. There's just things that are kind of, I'm bringing this up also kind of the similarities between like immigration and police reform that both our countries are going through. So who is Jose Antonio Cast? So this is the far right wing candidate that Boric ran against. He was a longtime supporter of Augusto Pinochet, has been in and out of the party that was most closely associated with Pinochet. He had ran before in 2017 and lost then too. He comes from he's a German. His parents are German. His father was a Nazi, not a high-ranking one, but a Nazi nonetheless. And Chile also has a big German community as well. And he really comes from a very Catholic, social conservative background, and is incredibly anti-immigrant. And as I mentioned in one of my pieces, he was welcoming the Venezuelans at one point, as refugees from Bolivarian socialism, and now has turned on them and has been pushing and kind of has this like Trump-like attitudes where he would be like, instead of like, where Trump proposed a wall in the United States, he's like, let's build a big ditch because Chile has a huge desert in the land they took from Bolivia. And so he's like, well, let's build a big ditch and the immigrants will just fall in. And which is like not a real policy solution, much less a practical one, but kind of shows like he has gimmicks that like are very Trump-like in that way and doesn't actually have real solutions, but plays on people's emotion. And so he's very like he likes Trump, but he's actually, you'll see he's now willing to go full right-wing fascist in certain ways that like Trump and the Brazilian equivalent Jair Bolsonaro did. But he definitely has sympathies to them and obviously uses some of their playbook. So I was watching the first round from the States, and I was very worried. And my fears, and I'll talk about, I really thought Cast was going to win for a few reasons. And so I want you to look at kind of these first round results. So Boric was actually leading in the polls at times with 35% of the vote among the 7 candidates. And Cast ended up finishing first. Not by a lot, but still finishing first, which was like really demoralizing. And what was really fascinating for me was, because I was following closely, I thought, but not as closely as I really should have been, was this guy Franco Parisi from Party of the People finished third. Parisi is kind of like the Andrew Yang of Chile, and he's not in Chile. He's actually living in Alabama, avoiding child support issues. So he actually wasn't in any of the debates that I saw, so I didn't even know he was running. So this guy who's not even in Chile finished third among all the candidates, running on some like kind of broad, like not left, not right, but forward kind of Andrew Yang-like campaign. So that said a lot to me. So what I did was I wanted to show you that I colored the results here. And you can see it. So in like kind of aqua blue, I'm showing that those are like new parties that have been created recently. And in kind of like orangish red are the historic parties. So Savan Sisicho was like the center-right candidate. Yanis Provoste was the center-left candidate representing those historic coalitions that I said governed Chile for 30 years. And there's a guy who's like from a communist party split, like a historic party, but it got like 1.4% of the vote. But 3/4 of the voters who showed up in the first round voted for a new party. So since no one got the majority, that forced the second round. But I was like, wow. And so you see like with the constitutional process, you see like a huge rejection of the traditional parties there, where even they fell out of the top three. The people who had ruled Chile couldn't even get into the top three. And I was also worried because I did some envelope math, which I show you here. And in blue are the right-wing parties, and I'm counting the Andrew Yang person as right-wing. And for this intensive purposes, because of his program there, not because of anything to do with Yang. And the left parties in red. And the right-wing parties, got more votes, just objectively speaking. And I was like, wow, so is there like a majority for the right wing that I just didn't see? And I was wrong. And we're going to go into, I think, why I was wrong in a few reasons. But then because you guys, because like the plotted twist is revealed, you all know Boric won. But how he won is, I think, interesting, and how he came back from underperforming in the first round to doing incredible, to really blowing, to really not having a landslide, but really having a commanding victory in the second round a month later. So we'll go into that in a second. But first I want to show, so I was sent by DSA formally as a delegate to the Chilean election. So the activities I went to were largely hosted by a Pueblo Dignidad, who I mentioned this was the coalition that was backing Gabriel Boric. And I was there. Those activities were over the course of December 16th to 19th. But I'll show other events that happened as well. So in addition, so this is where it goes into like my summer vacation part. And then I'll get back to political analysis. So once again, you see like on the left, I'm meeting with Chilean trade unionists, which was organized by the guy in the front on the right, Camilo, who comes from Socialist Party. So Chile has, what was really interesting there I learned was that Chile has kind of like this weird open shop policy where people can become members of different unions have to compete in kind of like a free market way for members. It's hard for a union to have, so in the United States, like a union represents like, can just vote, workers vote to be represented by one union. There they can like pick and choose, which really weakens labor bargaining power because like one company will have like 5 unions representing the same type of workers. And you'll also, and then also, but and the guy, and in the middle, you see on the right hand side of the left hand picture, there's the guy who's hosting number 1. That's Andres Giordano. So he is actually just elected to Congress, and he is a Starbucks worker who helped start the Starbucks union in Chile a few years ago that represents several hundred workers. And so he's scheduled to actually do an event with DSA and some Starbucks workers here to kind of, because they're obviously very excited about the organizing that the coffee chain is doing, the workers of the coffee chain are doing in this country. So that was really something I felt was really proud of, that I think is coming out of these international exchanges. And I think we should strive for more kind of like follow up like that. On the right, I also met with the Chilean Socialist Party International Secretary and some of the other people. What was interesting is like they told me the reason they do their fists in the right is because communists do their fists in the left. So just a random anecdote if you ever in a trivia night about Chilean politics. And they have an office that was actually near the one of the watch party for Boric, which I'll show you later. And then, so Chile has an interesting rule where they actually prohibit campaigning 2 days before the election. So I mean, I couldn't imagine a world without a GOTV weekend and like calling people until the last minute. Chile, it's the opposite. It's like after on the 16th was like, there are these what are called Cierre de Campañas, campaign closing, so the big closing rally. So on the left, you can see me and the other international delegates from like Germany, Spain, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, at least, marching over in France as well. And then there's and then the picture I took of myself, little selfie at the rally. And this was the first time I had some hope that Boric was going to win, because I'm not kidding. I had pains in my stomach for days. I just thought Boric was going to lose. And the reason why I did was just the vibes. There's no other thing. Was just Boric's rally. They said it 50,000 people. It probably didn't have that at 50,000 people, but definitely had tens of thousands of people. And Jose Antonio Cast was not able to crack 10,000 people, which people who had been in the first round told me was a huge change when like the left-wing people were only getting several hundred folks to rallies. So and these were overwhelmingly young people at the rally, which you'll see really made a huge difference. So young people were very enthusiastic about voting. So the next day, I had two events. On the left, I met with the Democratic Revolution's president, Margarita Portugues, who comes out of like what would be equivalent of the communication workers union. So that was actually really important that they have a union president now, because a president comes from the union movement. Because as I mentioned earlier, Boric doesn't really unlike DSA, even though DSA has changed and it's different now. DSA is still very committed to the trade union movement. That's a noticeable difference with the new leftists in Chile they're pro-union, but they're not in and around labor, even like the way DSA is. And so I think it was a promising sign that they have more union folks in leadership. And on the left-hand side of that picture on the left is Ross Mitiga, who some of you may know. He teaches now in Chile, but he was one of the first nationally endorsed DSA candidates post Bernie in 2016. He ran for a House Delegate seat. And then on the right, we met with Giorgio Jackson, who is a congressman who's going to be, but now he is one of the main student leaders. And he probably might have been the presidential candidate, except he's too young by a year. And now he's going to be what's equivalent to Boric's chief of staff. So but that's a cabinet minister position in Chile, unlike in the United States. So, and then we split up the day on the 18th, and we went to Valparaiso to meet, which is kind of like the San Francisco of Chile. It's on the sea. The other major city of Chile. It's where the Congress actually is, because Pinochet put it there to kind of make the Congress less powerful by not having it in the capital. And so on the left, I'm with the governor, Rodrigo Mundaca, who comes out of like a water protection social movement. And it was really fascinating to be with him and hear him talk about David Harvey and Karl Marx. Again, I couldn't even imagine like a lot of our American elected being like so profoundly intellectual and also tied to a real social movement. And then we also met with like 5 mayors from like neighboring areas who are all like from the coalition party. And it was a really nice experience. And we are is like a former prison that was prison, and then became a torture center, and is one of the areas that like Chile has tried to make like kind of build hope on and build a cultural center on what had been a very dark part of their history. Then that night we met with like both communists and people from Frente Amplio who had been elected to the Constitutional Convention. So this woman second to the right is Bea Sanchez. So she was the presidential candidate for Frente Amplio in 2017. And this was an interesting conversation. I could see real political differences between the coalition members, the Dignidad coalition members, where like I think the communists were much more ready if Cast won to like go headstrong, and I think the Frente Amplio folks, the more democratic socialists, were like more like, okay, maybe we have to slow down. And the woman on the right, Barbara Sepulveda, she's a communist. She actually made a really excellent point, which I think is worth sharing. She mentioned, I've used the term somewhat, but I'm stealing it from her, where she says like the right wing really has a playbook, and she brought up like there's the ditch that Pass wants, there's the wall that Trump wants, but we don't really have this international playbook. We're the internationalists, but we don't actually have ideas that we're really sharing comparably. And she just said, like, in the right wing, she points out the right wing demagoguery really works, where she made this good analogy where she says, like, you could have 50 people waiting for medical care in Chile, and if the person on the line, 50th person on the line went to the left and said, like, why is the line too long? The leftist would be like, well, neoliberalism has destroyed our like medical centers, and like we are like have really bad universal health care in this country because of like underfunding. And if the person went to the right-wing person would be like, well, it's because 25 of the people in front of you are immigrants. Why don't we just get rid of them? And the line would be shorter. And it's like, and she's like, we have to like have the ethical answer. She's not saying let's get more racist, but she's saying like we need like more concise and clear explanations for people, or else people kind of get sucked in by the demagoguery. And then on election night, we just went to this hotel, and also on the left are it's like the presidential candidate, the president of the party, and the international secretary of PSOL, who is like a left-wing party in Brazil. And then Margarita Portugues, who I mentioned earlier, and Andres Giordano, who's the Starbucks worker. You can see his mask from the Starbucks union there. And then election night was a lot of fun. I did not expect us to win, and then we won. But of course, I kind of got stuck in the middle. So we weren't on the streets. So the fellow on the left is me, kind of corralled in, and then the right is like what I would have loved to have been seeing with Boric winning. So now back to some analysis, and then I will try to hurry it up because I know we won't have time for Q&A. So the voter participation in national elections has really declined since the end of obligatory voting in 2013. So you see here, it's really hovered around 50%. But then one of the reasons Boric won was because if you look on the far right, it jumped nearly 8%. It jumped over 8% from the first, second round, which is not actually typical, as you'll see. But there was a huge influx of voters. So you see that actually turnout, can go down in Chile for the second round, or it just goes up like a few points. But this was like a really huge boom. So why did that happen? I have a few different reasons that we'll go into, but I think one huge thing was gender. You see here that I know it's in Spanish, so I'm going to explain. So aqua is like the first round, deep blue is the second round turnout, and then the M is for mujeres, women, and the H is for hombres, men. So you see that there's pretty much a really big boon in turnout, but especially among women, and especially among younger women. And really that Chile has made huge progress on choice, on gay rights, on lots of things that people were really worried that someone like Cast, who was totally the right-wing candidate, who was totally out of step with where the country would really set things back. So there was a real motivation to elect somebody who was not going to push things back. And you really see the huge difference in support among young women for Boric in red, and even in young men, but really difference between women in the beginning who really want something more progress. Whereas Chile traditionally, you notice, but if you look as the older you get, actually support for Boric dramatically declines, but it's actually not, the gender differences aren't as stark there. So, and so that's something good to know, is that people really, there was a huge young people turnout, which is kind of like, which really made a key difference, and a lot of people came out. So why did this happen? I think one is because really, I don't know how great a campaign Boric won, though he did really improve in the second round. There was news analysis that showed he did a better job of doing outreach. But like Cast was the only candidate of those 7 candidates I mentioned earlier who opposed the Constitutional Convention. So people in Cast, while he couldn't stop the constitutional process, people knew he could lead a campaign against to vote no. And so people really didn't want to lose that. Also, the more people got to know Cast, the less they liked him. And when we were meeting at the campaign headquarters with Giorgio Jackson, he brought up that, the more people think of Pinochet, the lower Cast's approval goes down. And kind of helpful in that way, in a morbid sense, was Pinochet's very unpopular widow died a few days before the election. So people suddenly started remembering Pinochet what a crook, because these people also stole money. They weren't just murderers. I mean, they actually were also crooks. So people, and that was very, and that really hurt the credibility with a lot of right-wing people. So what I think will happen is, and then I'll stop here, is Boric still doesn't have he had an overwhelming victory, but the Congress was set by the first round that had the lower turnout. And there's just not the left-wing coalition there. And he's had to already, so he's announced his cabinet that has a few communists, has a lot of people from his coalition, but also has a lot of socialists, and I say socialists with a big S, from the people from the Socialist Party. So he's really had to expand out, and he's also had to have a finance minister who has been in previous governments, but who really is the only one I've read who's like the main person who's kind of continuing to kind of calm down the business community. And he may end up just being a caretaker or president. By that, I mean, he may only serve a few years because the Chilean new constitution, if it passes, may call for immediate elections. And that may be actually the best situation for him because he can't actually do a lot. He could do some things if people want to ask. I'm happy to talk about them in the questions, but that's about it for now. So I'm going to stop sharing. I really want to thank you again. I haven't been able to read the chat, so I'm sorry if you asked me anything or told me to slow down. I just wasn't able to look at both at the same time. I'm sorry, but I will stop there. So I appreciate it. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, David. We have a few minutes left for Q&A. So if you have a question for David, whether it's something he's mentioned just now or something you're thinking about from something you've read, feel free to drop it into the chat, and David can spend a couple minutes answering. And panelists, that goes for you as well. If you want to ask questions, feel free.
So I think I see it, Joseph. Maybe if there's one more person, we can do 2 questions at once, and then I can answer them at the same time.
Yeah, whatever we prefer.
So Joseph, why don't you put your question in, and then I'll answer you and Patricio's question. Okay, so I'll answer those quickly. If anyone else has any other questions, I'll do the best that I can. So actually, that's a really good question, Nate, too. So maybe you can just throw that in there, and that can help with for Patricia's question as well. So the process of being hosted was, it was interesting. There was only a few dozen. There's probably maybe a dozen and a half international delegates, mainly from, as I write in the Democratic left, from new party formations like Podemos in Spain, PSOE, and what was the other one? And then some of the Argentinian ones as well. So it shows that the Boris government is still trying to develop. They're not in any international. Some of them used to be in Sao Paulo Forum, but they've left, which DSA is going to join or has joined as our convention voted on. So they're still kind of figuring out their things. And so I think a lot of it was like they just really want to build ties and really want to get to know one another. And I think that, so on Patricio's good question is, I think I'm very humble that it's hard to tell what the next 5 years will look like, because I think it really depends on what I was mentioning earlier, the Chileans, what happens in the constitutional process and what happens with social movement pressure. So basically the Chileans have elected 155 people to work on the constitution. The right wing didn't do a good job with this process. So it actually is super majority left, which has been very good. So I'm answering some of the questions I'm seeing come along too. But the Chileans will have to vote again to ratify this constitution by a majority vote, but I said it's an obligatory vote. So, and that could go into effect immediately. They could do things like most extreme, they could not in a bad sense, but like they could maybe call for like a triumvirate, 3 people not a president. They may get rid of the Senate, which I would love to do in this country. I hope they do there because the Senates are huge blocks. They could do a lot to protect the environment. Like I mentioned, nationalizing lithium, which I think you have to remember, like, isn't also just for money for Chile. It also like takes lithium out of the market. So Chile can be like, we don't want to destroy our environment so quickly with lithium. We'll take it slow. Like that's like what you can do if you have national control. And so I feel like so I think so people asking like what's next and what the process for 5 years, I think it's that he really can do something. So Chile is a very strong presidency by executive system. So for example, Borda could do, while he can't maybe pass things with legislation like we're seeing now, he could like do more to like legalize the undocumented workers and immigrants in Chile, and really help to bring them more out of the margin of society. There's lots of anti-immigrant violence, and that's been really bad. He could, just use the bully pulpit to kind of pass a few more things here and there, and so forth. So I also just kind of, and so it's really, so I think someone else asked, like, what's the response to the United States been? I think it's probably mixed in the States. Like, I think that you can imagine Joe Biden probably, and I think there was a lot of, if you read the Capitalist Press, I think they kind of reflected what the Biden administration said, which is like, oh God, these people are both terrible. Because I don't think Joe Biden wants more Bolsonaros in the Americas, but he also doesn't want more leftists either. So he's kind of like, oh, can I get somebody I can work with? So I think it's probably kind of like at least benign neglect right now. So I don't see, and I saw somebody ask the question like, could you see an assassination attempt? And I think what I learned there, which was really, really interesting, and then I'll try to maybe do one more question and end on time, is the military is very powerful in Chile and still kind of independent. But so they could turn down when the current president Piñera said in 2019, can you like do martial law? They said, can you give us immunity? And he said no. Then they're like, no, we're not going to do that. Because basically, the compromise when Chile returned to a constitutional democracy was, the army will be the fall people, and the ruling class who like actually gained and profited won't go to jail. So the army is kind of like, well, we're not going to do that again. So so there's much less support from the military to do those kind of interventions if they don't have the backing from the ruling class. They've already felt kind of undermined a few times. I'm just doing it's very weird real politic of it. And so actually the police are the worst of them because the police never had to do the kind of truth and reconciliation process that the army did. So it's really, I'll just stop there because I think there's a lot of hope. There's got to limit your expectations a little bit, like we saw with the appointment of the kind of standard person to kind of calm the markets. But, I think it's really up in the air, and I hope that the Chilean movements stay alive, and I think it's pretty inspiring. So I just want to thank you guys all again, comrades, for giving me the chance to talk about this. It was a really great experience. I wish you all could have been there with me, but you got to see a little bit of it through this. So I really appreciate it, and a lot of love to Atlanta DSA, and it's hard to express, but you guys were really such an amazing part of my DSA experience.
Thank you so much, David. I really wish we could kind of just be in person and applause and people mingle and go to a bar afterwards. But thanks so much for joining us on Zoom. Folks, feel free to throw love and things. I know a few people already did for David and this talk. I'm really glad we were able to start off the new year with a really cool political education session.